So here at Bellefontaine Cemetery, we definitely have our share of notables, and there's no more notable than William Clark. William Clark, Meriwether Lewis, and their expedition is very key to westward expansion. And whenever we get into these details, we always have to bring in an expert. And it's an expert that you, Joe, and I know very well.
I can't imagine wrapping your head around being charged with exploring half of a continent that Thomas Jefferson just bought, and the ins and outs that go with that, the perils that go with that, the unknown. That would be a task now. But in 1803, that had to have been just overwhelming. And what better person to talk about how overwhelming that was and what it took and the stories that surround all of that than Jerry Garrett.
The Jerry Garrett.
The Jerry Garrett.
This is the Can You Dig It podcast. We crawl into the crypts, gardens, and forgotten cemeteries. Join Dan Fuller, your resident cemetery chronicler, and Joe Shields, the plot-loving development exec, as we unearth the dark secrets of St. Louis and Bellefontaine Cemetery and beyond. From garden geeks to history buffs with a taste for the macabre, as well as fans of iconography, this is your podcast. We love diving deep into the shadows of history. Let's dig in.
So here we are again talking about Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum, one of my favorite things to talk about. And I can't talk about it by myself. I have Joe Shields with me, who is currently our development officer, but came to us about 7 years ago as a volunteer, a very enthusiastic volunteer who took on some projects of his own, kind of made it as his own thing, and then grew to a staff position here at Bellefontaine Cemetery.
My name is Joe Shields. I am honored to head up development for Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Fuller, who I met as a very young volunteer. Dan has moved from event and volunteer coordinator to now the cemetery chronicler, or the cemetery historian, and it has just been a pleasure of a lifetime working and learning from Dan.
And I could not be who I am if it wasn't for the person that we have as a guest today, and that's Jerry Garrett. When I got here to Bellefontaine, there was Mary Ellen, Kathleen, and most importantly, as I like to say, the Jerry Garrett, who has got a very enthusiastic approach to the way he does tours at Bellefontaine. And as we get into our conversation today, we'll talk about the person that he has a particularly strong interest in. Okay, Jerry Garrett. When did you get bitten by the bug of finding out so much about a gentleman named William Clark?
Probably 40 years ago, 1984.
That's precise.
Right. So I was 40 years old. I quit my job. I bought a van, and I set out on a trip that had a couple of goals. The number one goal was to drive through all 48 contiguous states and to drive as far south, east, north, and west as one could drive in the country. And I succeeded in meeting those goals. I was gone just short of 100 days, and I traveled just a little bit less than the circumference of the globe. So I met a lot of historic Americans on that trip. And I was real pumped up about my trip, and I wanted to read about more. And I had encountered Lewis and Clark a couple of times on that trip. So I picked an abbreviated paperback of their journal written by John Bakeless, and I've been reading about Lewis and Clark ever since.
The core of discovery. There's nothing more, as I'm concerned with here in St. Louis, as connecting us to everything that's west of the Mississippi. And I cannot imagine what it would have been like for those guys. I was kind of associated with the moonshot of its time, going out there to find the Northwest Passage. So did you make it through the Northwest Passage?
on subsequent trips when I was in that part of America, and there are Lewis and Clark sites east of the Mississippi that I would either make plans or alter plans or expand plans so I could go to sites that Lewis and Clark had been to. So I did get there, but on my drive trip, it was just accidental that I ran across them. But they had started in St. Louis. I had started in St. Louis. They made it to the Pacific. I made it to the Pacific. So I had a certain kinship to them and wanted to learn more.
Lewis and Clark and Jerry Garrett.
And Sacagawea and the dog.
There we go.
So, Jerry, on your journey, throughout years of studying about Lewis and Clark, what is one or two aha moments that you had, or one or two aspects of the core of discovery that just wowed you?
So on their trip, and I learned this when I started reading, when they left the Mandan villages in North Dakota in I think it was April 7th, 1805, until they encountered the Shoshones, the people of Sacagawea, which was in August, April to August. They did not see another human being.
Wow.
It's just, that couldn't, with exception maybe walking across Antarctica, I mean, that's just impossible on the globe today to do that. Now, we believe, of course, that the Native Americans saw them, but to go that distance of time, April 7th to August, without seeing another human being, just amazes me.
Again, especially when you consider what's there now.
Right.
I can't imagine. What else really caught your attention?
Well, early on, when I knew very little about it, as I was an ordinary American, and still many ordinary Americans today know very little, although the bicentennial of the expedition, which was in the years 2003 through 2006, I think has elevated the general public's understanding. But when they reached the Shoshone, they call him a chief. We've learned that Native Americans' structure of their societies was different than the Euro-American, so they had perhaps more than one of what we would call a chief. They maybe had a social chief, a military chief, or whatever. But the chief was Sacagawea's brother. I mean, it's just amazing, that
all the stuff we don't know.
Right. That to have that sort of connection happen, personal connection happen on the trip.
Yep. Now, for me, one of the things that was a little aha moment was finding out that John O'Fallon was actually William Clark's nephew. And then that kind of revolves around the fact that William Clark is with us because he was not originally buried here at Bellefontaine.
So, learning that O'Fallon, I don't know when I learned that, and it's been in the last, at my age, time goes so fast you can't keep it straight, but Clark had two wives, and his second wife was literally a first cousin to his first wife, and she was a widow. And she had some children, including a daughter, and that daughter married Stephen Watts Kearny, who is famous in his own regard for activities in California in the Mexican-American War. And both he and his wife, who is the stepdaughter of Clark, are buried in the cemetery. I found that real strange, but it was from his second wife's...
2 degrees of separation
right,
here. We don't have to go to the 7 degrees of separation.
So that some of these people related to each other, and with the woman's last name changing because of marriage, it gets real surprising because the last name doesn't ring a bell if you're looking for that. And then Dr. Farrar, who is also buried here, he married a niece of Clark's. So the family relationships here are not insignificant.
Yep. Interwoven to a certain extent. That's one of the projects that part of our volunteer force has been doing, is to connect these different branches of the trees together so that we really understand better of how they are interconnected. And I go back to that fact that William Clark was not buried here initially. He was actually buried elsewhere and then brought at a later date. And I always bring that up from a genealogical standpoint because I always focus on the fact that cemeteries are focused on arrival, not on death. And so his burial date for us is actually 1860, though he died in 1838.
And I'm going to steal a line from Dan that I use on countless tours, that using General Clark as an example, that just because you're dead does not mean you quit traveling.
Right. Well, I'm glad that Jerry got all of his traveling in before he died, though. What else was kind of, I don't know, maybe like an epiphany moment for you? And it wouldn't necessarily have to be the whole Lewis and Clark aspect, but what, if you had to tell somebody on your travels, don't miss this spot, what would be one of those spots?
Well, Sacagawea, in the Lewis and Clark community, it's full of unanswerable questions. And I've enjoyed reading the scholars as they make their journey to come up with their conclusion, which will differ from some other scholars' conclusion. And to date, there's been no bloodshed because of the disagreement, and because I think everybody from the get-go knows that there's no way to determine a definitive answer. And so on Sacagawea, where and when did she die is in those major unanswerable questions. So most believe she died, I can't remember the year, whether 1812 or around near where Mobridge, South Dakota is. And that part of the Missouri River is now under a lake. So if that's where she did die and was buried, the gravesite is
covered over.
So it's going north, upstream on the river, on the left side, there is a monument to Sacagawea by the people that believe that's where she was. So I went there so I could check off some obscure Americana and impress people with, as I'm trying to do now. And there was another bust there. And this is in South Dakota, wonderful state, but they have 4 trees. I mean, it's just really, there's just nobody around. And so there are these 2, and I thought, who the hell is this? And I went over, and it was a bust of a male, a Native American, and had a name that I didn't recognize at first. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, I recognize it. It was Sitting Bull.
Oh.
But Sitting Bull was dead, and talk about moving. He was dead and buried in North Dakota, and for reasons I've forgotten the details, in the dead of night, they dug him up and moved him across the state line to near Mobridge, South Dakota, and buried him under concrete or something so he can never be buried again. So your question used something about surprise discovery. I just was astounded that here were 2 well-known Native American historic people, and they're the 2 of them right there by themselves. And I was the only one there. I couldn't yell and tell everybody there.
So, Jerry, before we get too much more into the story of the Corps of Discovery, if you could please answer a question for listeners that aren't familiar with the Corps of Discovery. Where did it start? Where did they go? How long did it take to get there? And they came back to where? Okay,
so I was an accountant, debits equal credits, assets, liability. So I like detail and lined up stuff.
Right on.
So Corps of Discovery is included nowhere in the documentation.
Oh, cool.
There is a letter or something in which talked about the Northwest something of discovery, and we think that it stems from that, but it has entered mainline, so there's no pulling it back. But if you like to be able to go to the documentation and to point to right here is where it got its name, not going to happen.
Jefferson never referred to it anything?
Never. So maybe that's life, but that's full of Lewis and Clark. So in the unanswerable questions, one of is where did the Lewis and Clark expedition begin? And how much time do we have? Till sunset?
Something like that.
So it really varies. To the west of here, the little town of Marthasville, Missouri, lays claim to being the start, because when they left the little village there that was La Charette, a town that's gone, they left Euro-American civilization. So the argument there. And you can continue eastward to St. Louis, which basically Louis was in St. Louis, but Clark and the men were up near Hartford, Illinois. So St. Louis really as a starting point is in the flavor of and not specific. Hartford, Illinois, where they spent the first winter, and in which Lewis has a quote, which they've engraved on there, that this is determined as the point of departure would be the beginning. Louisville, where Clark joined Lewis, is the start. Pittsburgh, where the boat was made, is labeled as the start of the expedition. So the Diplomat answers the question that the Lewis and Clark expedition began in the mind of Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, so, I like that one.
And so in January of 1803, Jefferson sent a secret request to the Congress for money to explore for scientific and educational interest the interior of the continent. The land was owned by the French, so it was for scientific and educational reasons, reflecting Jefferson's Enlightenment man approach to knowledge. In the spring of the year, late spring of the year, the French offered to sell not only New Orleans, which was what the principal thing that Jefferson wanted to buy because of what they were doing to travel, they offered to sell the whole kit and caboodle. And Monroe was his emissary, probably outside his authority, signed on the dotted line, and they got the Louisiana Purchase. And so that changed the whole nature of the trip now. So instead of going to learn stuff, they were now going to explore this new addition that the country owned. And Clark joined Lewis in the fall of 03 as he was coming down the Ohio, and they spent the winter of 03 and 04. Lewis was across the river at Cahokia waiting for the paperwork to be signed that he could now come onto this side of the river. And the men did not stay because the Spaniards said, "You're military, I officially don't know of the change. I cannot allow you on foreign country." So that's why they were separated.
So whoa, Jerry, hold on to that thought for just a second. We are going to take a break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about how they did get in.
If you can dig it.
In today's fast-paced digital world, where every message competes for attention, how do you ensure your voice stands out above the noise? Introducing EG Media Group, your ultimate destination for cutting-edge content creation. Our expert team specializes in crafting captivating videos and engaging podcasts that leave a lasting impression on your audience. But we're more than just content creators. Are you an aspiring author? Let EG Media Group be your guide through the publishing process, from editing to cover design. Imagine your manuscript transformed into a masterpiece, ready to connect with readers around the world. Don't just write your book. Launch it strategically with EG Media Group as your partner in author success. Visit egmediagroup.com today for a free consultation and turn your dream into reality. That's egmediagroup.com. EG Media Group. Create, connect, convert.
And we're back speaking today with the one and only Jerry Garrett, longtime Bellefontaine Cemetery and Arboretum volunteer and local and national expert on the Lewis and Clark expedition. So, Jerry, you were talking about the city of Cahokia right before we went to break, and a lot of people won't recognize that name. So if you could please just spend maybe a minute or two explaining Cahokia.
Okay, interesting question, and sorry that I made a presumption there. Most American history we think of from east to west. The French history of America is from north to south, and the French arrived from Canada to the northern Mississippi, put the flag in it, claimed it for the French king, and came down the river, and they came to this part of the country which became known as the American Bottom, and it's where the Illinois and the Missouri quickly joined the Mississippi, making this flat land. It's where the pre-Columbian civilization, the Cahokians, came. And so the French established, I believe, 7 little villages in here before New Orleans was created. Not many people know that. Cahokia was the first of these little French villages. It was started, I can't remember it, 1600 something. And then there were 5 others, and then St. Genevieve, which was on the other side of the Mississippi, which is why St. Genevieve lays claim to being the oldest Euro-American city. But was part of this collective that the French did here in the beginning, because they were coming down the Mississippi. They were not going from the Pilgrims to the Gold Rush. So most of our history is that east to west story. But here in the center of the country, the story is really a north to south story. So Cahokia was, it had been a player in the Revolutionary War, no bloodshed, but it was the furthest west point on the east side of the Mississippi. And there was a post office there. And so when Lewis came up, went across the river, and the Spaniards could not welcome him, although they thought this trip sounded pretty darn interesting. So he stayed in Cahokia from December of 03 to March of 04, when the paperwork, or the locals have the famous Three Flag ceremony. And so then Lewis moved across the river, stayed with the Choteaus and the other glitterati.
And just so people know, that the Day of Three Flags is when what will become the Louisiana Purchase for the United States will transfer first from Spanish to French, and then from French to American. And as I always like to say, this is true St. Louis history because we call it the Day of Three Flags, which was a 2-day event.
So Clark and the men went up to land across from the confluence of the Mississippi with the Missouri, and they spent the winter there. So Clark and the men left on May 14th, and Lewis, with the Choteaus and other people that wanted to get in the history books, they got on horseback and went to St. Charles and met Clark there. So to the story, where did the expedition begin? That's St. Charles's claim that there where it began, because that's where Lewis and Clark both got on the boat together. They left there on May 20-something, and they headed upriver and made it to the Mandan villages in North Dakota. When they left St. Louis, estimated population of St. Louis was 1,500. Estimated population of the Mandan, and it was the Mandans, the Hidatsa, and the Arikaras, 3 tribes, nations that had to come together for joint survival. Estimated population, 5,000. So major just change in whatever. In anticipation of the winter, they spent the winter there. They hired an interpreter, Toussaint Charbonneau. When they learned that his wife, a young pregnant woman, was a Shoshone of the Indian nation that they knew they were going to have to interact with to get horses to go over the mountains, and she came along with them. So they left there in April of 05, made it to the West Coast in the area of Astoria, Oregon in late 05, and stayed there through the winter and left on March 23rd, 1806, returned to the Mandan College, said goodbye to Sacagawea and Toussaint Charbonneau, returned downriver, and arrived in St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806. So the trip was 2 years, X months, X days, hours, and minutes or so. But that's a quick summary of how long they were gone. And in due respect to Americans that don't know everything, of which regrettably I'm one of those, many people thought it was 2 men, Sacagawea, in a canoe. But it was several vessels, a couple of dozen of people, and it lasted 2 years plus.
You know, to kind of draw a parallel between your journey across the country to see all contiguous 48 states, did you ever think about what it was like for Lewis and Clark and their non-van situation? Because I always look at it from the standpoint they're taking those keel boats and literally pulling them up against the flow of the river.
So again, my trip, for which I'm very proud and happy to have in memory, precedes my interest in Lewis and Clark. So I was not comparing myself to them. But on my trip, I became aware of, and I met people in air-conditioned Airstreams with, they didn't have widescreen TVs back then, to backpackers walking along the highway and everything in between. Bicyclists, people in vans like me, people in campers. I mean, it was Americans traveling the country, and their methodology varied again from the air-conditioned Airstream to the guy in a backpack, just left foot, right foot, left foot. So Americans have done that forever.
Yep, back to then. You've been associated with a number of ways of remembering our friends Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. I think you have a statue with a plaque out there at the river. Can you talk a little bit about the program to do that memorialization?
Yes, a local Lewis and Clark devotee, Lucy Huger, wonderful woman, the only woman and person I know who has stood on top of the arch, which is a pretty unique thing to have in your biography. She got a bee in her bonnet. There needed to be a statue in the St. Louis area that commemorated the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I mean, somebody that can get a red light put on top of the arch can get about anything done they've set out to do. So she started trying to find a place for it and finding some money. There was a period of time I thought it might be on the campus at UMSL, and some details that didn't come possible. So I can't remember whether the decision to place it on the riverfront was before or after Lucy died, but the statue was not erected at the time of her death. And the sculptor is Harry Weber, who's done sculptures all over the world, but heavily concentrated in St. Louis, and many statues that people now recognize are Harry. And so Harry was the sculptor. Nancy Hawes, a real estate lawyer, worked with getting the statue placed, because you were talking about city land, the Park Service federal land. It was not just a simple, where are we going to put it? And the statue, and it's called Captain's Return, and it is Lewis and Clark and the dog. And Clark is waving like a handkerchief to the people on shores, and it was put in the cobblestone part of downtown. In the floodings of the Mississippi, the water would rise, and it would, all you could see was Clark's head and waving like, I'm drowning, you know. And it would make national news, which I thought was pretty cool advertisement. Harry said that it was damaging the statue more than they had anticipated. So the statue was moved up off the direct riverfront, and is now where, if it's ever underwater, pretty much we all are underwater.
We're in trouble.
So I knew Lucy, and through a mutual friend, I knew Harry. Sounds like I knew everybody in Movers Shakers, but I was doing what I could to get that statue there. And it's in a wonderful place because of the arch and the Western movement in St. Louis and the Mississippi River and Lewis and Clark. And it was viewable before when it was on the cobblestones, but it's viewable much more now. So it's a nice addition to Lewis and Clark in St. Louis.
Do you go down and check it out every now and then and reminisce of the struggle to get it placed?
Every once in a while, yeah. So when I can show off, because
I was going to say, showing other people.
Right.
So, Jerry, speaking of Clark and St. Louis, let's talk about what Clark had accomplished when he comes back to St. Louis and the journey's over with.
So the expedition ends in 2006, and both men get jobs. Lewis becomes the governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, which later became the Missouri Territory. And Clark gets a job as Indian agent. And so they both have jobs. 3 years later, Lewis is having a variety of problems, not the least of which is he had expended his own monies for things that he thought were the responsibility of his job. And so he was off to Washington to get this resolved with the War Department. Jefferson was no longer president, so those sort of inside tracks were gone. And on that journey, he died. He died in October of 2009. And most believe that he took his own life, but I can refer you to scholarly work who advocate that it was a murder or some other reason. So when I do tours at the cemetery, or let me back up, during the bicentennial, 2003 through 2006, the Mint altered the nickel to commemorate the expedition. They made 4 changes to the nickel, and when one of the 4 nickels was rolled out, it was in St. Louis. And so I bought a lot of nickels because I thought, oh, this will be a fortune. And so what am I going to do with these? So I've become a tradition of when I give tours and end up at the Clark grave, I give all attendees one of these bicentennial nickels. They were only done for 6 months at a time. So by definition, they're not as common as a normal annual nickel, and because of credit cards and Venmo or whatever coinage in circulation, so to run across a Lewis and Clark bicentennial nickel is rare because you don't get it and most people don't look at them. So I did give a tour several years ago, and I gave everybody a nickel. And one of the attendees later on that year on a trip visited Lewis's grave, and she left the nickel that I had given her at Lewis's grave and made me aware that she'd done that and sent me a picture of Facebook and all that. So within that same summer, my brother and I were on a drive trip to Chattanooga, and we stopped at Lewis's grave, and the nickel was still there. I just love that. That's been several years ago, but I've known people that have returned, so I'd like to know somebody that's going to Lewis's grave to look and see if the nickel is still there. But I just love that story.
Oh my gosh.
That's the legacy of the Jerry Garrett.
Or let me back up. So Lewis, he died in 2009, and there was a couple of other territorial governors, or maybe there was one other territorial governor, and then Clark became the territorial governor. He was candidate as we would call it today, for governor in the first election, was not successful for that. And he got another job, and then I believe that job, the first time he also was general in the militia. So he was Indian agent and superintendent of Indian Affairs. I'm not sure which came first. And then he lived till he died, as most of us do, until 1838. From 1820 until 1838. So he lived here a generation. He lived here from 06 to 38, so over 30 years. He married here, his 2 wives, he had his children. I'd always been interested in a little bit of history. I mentioned my trip. I had no idea Clark was buried in this town, and I can't remember when I learned that, but because of my interest in Lewis and Clark from my trip, and then I can't even remember my first visit to Clark's grave, but I was astounded that he was buried here, that I didn't know that, assuming I knew everything. So that was and that he then lived on this other life. Have a favorite story of a friend, Carolyn Gilman, who was the curator of the National Bicentennial Exhibition, which included all kinds of wonderful things collected. And there are only a few things left, but it was a wonderful exhibition. And she was recruited by the Missouri History Museum from Minnesota. And up there she dealt with Indian and fur trade and all those kind of stuff. She came down here, was working on getting ready on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and she was a couple of months, and then she realized this William Clark was the same William Clark that she was working with in Minnesota in Indian relationships. So his life has been so compartmentalized that here was a professional curatorial historian that didn't realize it was the same man in 2 different chapters of his life. Long answer to a short question, but he continued to serve here, was well liked, and was influential until what I used to say he died at the old age of 68. I no longer adjectivize.
You never feel that way now?
At 68, no. He was a prime of life man.
And he is still visited. It is the most visited spot at Bellefontaine Cemetery. And we get people from all over the world who share the passion that Jerry developed from his trip and continued on after that. And I know that we at Bellefontaine Cemetery call upon him whenever we have somebody who is interested in the story of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. We always appreciate your abilities and definitely your passion. And I, of course, like to spar with you to see who can one-up the next visit. So.
And Jerry, I sincerely appreciate, for one, you coming on today and lending your knowledge to all of our listeners, and Dan and I. But you're such a joy to work with, and I can say, from being a former volunteer to now, leading the development department here, I work with staff, I still work with volunteers, and I'm not spinning this at all. When your name gets brought up, it's an instant smile on everybody's face, because you are just a joy to work with, and what you bring to the table is just an immense amount of knowledge and just a great attitude.
The Jerry Garrett.
So if you're ever in St. Louis and you mention Jerry Garrett, you're doing it wrong. It's the Jerry Garrett.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Well, it was a pleasure, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the podcast, and please share this episode with your family and friends. If you got value from the episode as well as the podcast, you can do it right from the platform you are listening on. Take a screenshot and tag us and tag yourself. We are at Podcast Can You Dig It on Instagram.